An unspoken moment of closeness shattered the boundaries between us, altering everything in its wake. The night felt thick with tension, the kind that crept in the second I stepped inside. The air was dense, almost expectant, as if the house itself was holding its breath. I paused at the doorway, gripping my bag, a chill running through me that I couldn't shake. Paused at the doorway, gripping my bag, a chill running through me that I couldn't shake. Maybe it was exhaustion, or maybe it was something far deeper, something in the silence that hinted nothing would ever be quite the same. I closed the door softly, the faint echo of the latch reverberating through the empty rooms. My aunt's house was usually full of warmth, chats over tea in the kitchen, her laughter filling the air whenever we had one of our usual back and forths about movies or books. But tonight, all I had was stillness. The only sound came from my footsteps as I made my way through the house, past the dark living room and into the dimly lit kitchen, where I hoped to find something comforting to eat, and into the dimly lit kitchen, where I hoped to find something comforting to eat. As I stepped in, the soft hum of the refrigerator seemed almost deafening, filling the silence with its steady drone. I grabbed a glass from the cupboard and poured some water, trying to shake off the odd feeling that clung to me like a second skin. But no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't ignore it. I couldn't pretend it was just another night. Then, as I set the glass down on the counter, I heard it, a faint creak from upstairs. My pulse quickened and I froze, straining to listen. The sound was soft, barely there, but unmistakable. It was the sound of a door slowly opening. I waited, heart pounding as silence reclaimed the space. Maybe it was nothing, I told myself, but the hairs on the back of my neck stood on end, and I felt that shiver again, stronger this time. The thought crossed my mind that I should go upstairs, check on my aunt, see if everything was all right. But another part of me was rooted to the spot, a part that whispered that maybe I didn't really want to know what was happening upstairs. I finished my water and, with one last glance around the empty kitchen, made my way upstairs, my feet barely making a sound on the carpeted steps. The hallway stretched before me, dark and silent, with only a sliver of light seeping from beneath my aunt's door. I walked slowly, each step feeling heavier than the last, until I was standing just outside her room. I lifted my hand, hesitating before I knocked softly, a barely there tap that sounded louder in the silence. No answer. I stood there, heart pounding, debating whether to knock again, to open the door, or to just turn around and head back to my own room. Just as I was about to knock again, I heard a soft, almost inaudible sigh from inside. It was a sound so faint that I wasn't even sure I had heard it, but it was enough to make me turn the doorknob slowly, pushing the door open just a crack. The room was dimly lit, the only light coming from a small lamp on her nightstand, casting a soft glow across her face. She was lying on her side, her face turned toward the door, her breathing deep and steady. I watched her for a moment, feeling that strange mix of relief and something else, something I couldn't quite put into words. Maybe it was just the relief of knowing she was okay, that the unsettling feeling in the house was just my own nerves playing tricks on me. I closed the door as quietly as I had opened it and made my way back down the hall to my room. But as I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was still off. I closed my eyes, trying to push the thoughts away, telling myself I was just tired, that it was just the eerie silence of the house getting under my skin. But sleep didn't come easily. I tossed and turned, the shadows in the room seeming to shift and move like they were alive. Every creak, every groan of the old house made my pulse quicken, my mind conjuring up images of things lurking in the dark, just out of sight. Sometime in the early hours of the morning, I finally drifted into a fitful sleep. But it was a sleep filled with strange dreams, hazy and disjointed, dreams that left me with a lingering feeling of unease. I dreamt of shadows moving through the house, of footsteps echoing down empty hallways, of doors opening and closing on their own. When I woke up, the first light of dawn was streaming through the window, casting a pale glow across the room. I sat up slowly, rubbing my eyes, trying to shake off the remnants of the dream. But as I looked around, the strange feeling from the night before returned stronger than ever. I pulled on a sweater and made my way downstairs, hoping that the warmth of the morning sun would dispel the lingering sense of unease. But when I reached the kitchen, I stopped short. My aunt was sitting at the table, her eyes fixed on the cup of coffee in her hands, her expression distant and unreadable. "Morning," I said, my voice sounding too loud in the quiet. "Room." She looked up, her eyes meeting mine for a brief moment before she quickly looked away. "Morning," she replied, her voice barely above a whisper. I poured myself a cup of coffee and sat down across from her, the silence between us thick and uncomfortable. I wanted to ask her if she was okay, if something had happened last night, but the words stuck in my throat. She looked different, somehow. Her face was pale, her eyes shadowed with something I couldn't quite identify. It was like she was carrying a weight that I couldn't see, a burden that was pressing down on her. We sat there in silence for what felt like an eternity, each of us lost in our own thoughts. Finally, she stood up, muttering something about needing to get ready for the day. I watched her go, a strange feeling settling in my stomach, a feeling that told me that whatever was happening, it was far from over. The rest of the day passed in a blur. I went about my usual routine, but the strange feeling lingered, gnawing at the back of my mind. Every time I tried to push it away, it came back stronger, a constant reminder that something wasn't right. Her face was pale, her eyes shadowed with something I couldn't quite place. Worry, perhaps, or something deeper. She hesitated, then spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. "I couldn't sleep," she said, her gaze flickering away from mine. "Neither could I replied, feeling the tension between us intensify. I wanted to ask her what was wrong, to understand what was weighing on her, but the words wouldn't come. She shifted, glancing down the hall as if to make sure no one else was around. "Do you mind if I come in?" she asked, her voice soft, almost vulnerable. I stepped aside, letting her in. She walked into the room, her footsteps barely making a sound, and sat down on the edge of my bed. I closed the door and leaned against it, unsure of what to say or do. There was something fragile in her expression, a hint of something unspoken, and I felt a strange mix of curiosity and apprehension. For a long time, neither of us spoke. The silence stretched between us, heavy with all the things we weren't saying. Finally, she broke the silence, her voice barely above a whisper. "I've been feeling off lately," she said, her eyes fixed on the floor. "Like there's something I can't shake." I nodded, unsure of what to say. "Me too. It's like something's changed." She looked up at me, her gaze searching, as if she was trying to find the answer to a question she couldn't ask. "Maybe it's just this house," she murmured. "It has a way of getting under your skin." I sat down next to her, the bed creaking softly under our combined weight. We sat there in silence for a moment, both of us lost in thought. I wanted to ask her more, to understand what was bothering her, but I didn't know how to bridge the gap that had suddenly appeared between us. Finally, she spoke again, her voice barely audible. "Sometimes I feel like there's something between us, something we're not talking about." Her words hung in the air, and I felt my pulse quicken. There it was, the unspoken tension that had been lingering between us, finally brought to light. I didn't know what to say, how to respond to her words, so I just nodded, hoping that my silence would speak for me. She reached out, her hand resting lightly on mine, and I felt a jolt of surprise at the contact. It was such a simple gesture, but it carried a weight that I couldn't ignore. She looked at me, her gaze intense, and I felt a strange mix of emotions swirling inside me. Confusion, curiosity, even a hint of something I couldn't quite name. We sat there, our hands intertwined, and for a moment, the tension between us seemed to fade. But it was only a moment, a brief respite before the weight of everything came crashing back down. She pulled her hand away, a faint smile flickering across her face, but it didn't reach her eyes. "Maybe it's just the house," she said again, almost as if she was trying to convince herself. "Maybe it's just playing house," she said again, almost as if she was trying to convince herself. "Maybe it's just playing tricks on us." I nodded, but I wasn't convinced. There was something here, something more than just the house, something we weren't ready to acknowledge. I could feel it, lurking just beneath the surface, waiting for the right moment to make itself known. She stood up, smoothing her dress, her movements careful and deliberate. "I should go," she murmured, her voice tinged with something I couldn't quite place, regret maybe, or reluctance. I nodded, not trusting myself to speak. I didn't want her to go, didn't want to be alone in this house with nothing but my thoughts for company. But I knew that I couldn't ask her to stay, not when the tension between us was so thick it felt like it could snap at any moment. She walked to the door, pausing for a moment before she looked back at me. Pausing for a moment before she looked back at me. Her eyes met mine, and in that moment, I felt a connection, a silent understanding that went beyond words. It was as if we both knew that things would never be the same, that this moment had changed something between us, even if we weren't ready to admit it. "Good night," she whispered, her voice barely audible. Ready to admit it. "Good night," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "Good night," I replied, my voice just as soft. She slipped out of the room, closing the door quietly behind her, and I was left alone with the silence, the weight of her presence lingering long after she was gone. I lay back down, staring at the ceiling, my mind racing with questions I couldn't answer. I could still feel the warmth of her hand on mine, the way her gaze had held mine, intense and searching. I replayed the conversation in my mind, trying to make sense of it, trying to understand what had just happened. But no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted, something that couldn't be undone. The house was silent once again, but this time the silence felt different. It wasn't the same eerie stillness from before. It was a heavy, oppressive silence, filled with unspoken words and unresolved emotions. I felt trapped, caught in a web of confusion and uncertainty with no clear way out. Hours passed, but sleep eluded me. I lay there, wide awake, my mind filled with thoughts of her, of the way she had looked at me, the way her hand had felt against mine. I knew I couldn't ignore it, couldn't pretend that nothing had changed, but I didn't know what to do, didn't know how to move forward from this. And as I lay there, lost in thought, I heard it again, the soft creak of footsteps outside my door. My heart pounded and I sat up, straining to listen. The footsteps stopped just outside, lingering there for a moment before fading away into the silence. I lay back down, my mind racing, my heart still pounding. The night stretched on, filled with questions and uncertainty, and I knew that things would never be the same. The night stretched endlessly, shadows deepening, and the silence weighed on me like a heavy blanket. Every thought circled back to my aunt, to the way she had looked at me in the dim light, her hand resting on mine with a warmth that lingered, making it impossible to drift into sleep. I lay there, staring into the dark, to drift into sleep. I lay there, staring into the dark, haunted by questions and feelings I didn't dare name. Just as I was about to give up on sleep entirely, The quiet was broken by a soft knock on my door, gentle but unmistakable. My pulse quickened and I sat up, unsure if I had imagined it. But then, there it was again. A second knock, hesitant, almost as if she was debating whether to turn back. I took a deep breath and crossed the room, opening the door to find her standing there. She looked uncertain, her expression flickering with something I couldn't quite read. Her gaze softened when she saw me, and for a moment we just stood there, neither of us speaking, the silence between us thick and charged. "Couldn't sleep," she murmured, echoing the words from the previous night. But this time, there was something more in her tone, a quiet urgency that made my heart race. In her tone, a quiet urgency that made my heart race. "Neither could I replied, my voice barely above a whisper. I stepped aside, letting her into the room, and she walked in, her movements slow, deliberate. She paused by the window, looking out into the dark yard below, the faint moonlight casting a soft glow over her face. I stayed by the door, unsure of what to do, but feeling like something inevitable was unfolding between us. She turned to me, her gaze meeting mine with an intensity that made it impossible to look away. "Do you ever feel like there's something we're not saying?" she asked, her voice trembling slightly. She took a step closer, her eyes searching mine as though looking for an answer I didn't yet have. I swallowed, feeling the tension between us, the unspoken words that hung in the air. "Yes," I admitted, my voice barely audible. "I feel it too." She reached out, her fingers brushing against my arm, and the simple touch sent a shiver down my spine. It was like every unspoken thought, every unexpressed feeling had been building up, waiting for this moment. She moved closer, her hand lingering on my arm, her eyes fixed on mine. For a moment, I hesitated, my mind racing with doubts and questions. But then, before I could think it through, I leaned in, and our faces were so close, I could feel her breath on my skin. The world seemed to fade away, and all I could focus on was the warmth of her presence, the intensity of her gaze, the way her lips parted slightly as she looked at me. And then, as if drawn by an invisible force, we closed the distance, our lips meeting in a soft, hesitant kiss. It was a gentle touch, a tentative brush of lips, but it was enough to ignite something inside me, something I hadn't realized was there until now. We pulled back, our gazes meeting again, and the look in her eyes mirrored the feelings that had been swirling within me. There was a mix of wonder and uncertainty, of curiosity and longing, and it was as if we both understood, without words, that this moment had changed everything. Without a word, she stepped closer, and I wrapped my arms around her, pulling her close. I could feel the steady beat of her heart against my chest, a rhythm that matched my own. We stood there, holding each other, the silence between us filled with an unspoken connection that needed no words. Here's a rewritten version. Our lips met, breaths entwining in tender harmony. Her gentle gaze pierced mine, hearts connecting. She leaned in, whispering a soft, insistent kiss. Doubt dissolved. Tension melted. Our love unfolded. Her touch anchored me. Her embrace, a sanctuary. Shared breaths synchronized. Entwined, we lost ourselves. Hearts beating as one. Love shone bright. We finally broke apart, both of us breathing heavily, our foreheads pressed together as we tried to catch our breath. She looked up at me, a faint smile playing on her lips, and I felt a surge of affection, a warmth that seemed to fill every corner of my being. But as the moment stretched on, a flicker of uncertainty crossed her face, and she pulled back slightly, her gaze dropping to the floor. This isn't right," she murmured, her voice barely a whisper. "We shouldn't be like this." I felt a pang of guilt, a sudden awareness of the line we had crossed, and I took a step back, my heart heavy with the weight of our actions. But at the same time, I couldn't shake the feeling that this connection, this closeness, was real, that it meant something beyond the boundaries we had crossed. "We can't ignore it, though," I said softly, hoping she understood. "We both felt it, whatever this is." She looked up at me, her eyes filled with a mix of emotions, fear, guilt, and something else, something that mirrored the feelings I couldn't put into words. She took a shaky breath, her hand reaching out to touch mine, and I felt a surge of reassurance, a quiet affirmation that maybe, just maybe, we could find a way to navigate this uncharted territory together. But the uncertainty lingered, hanging in the air like a shadow. She pulled her hand away, her gaze drifting back to the window, as if looking for answers in the dark night beyond. "Maybe we should take some time to think about this," she said, her voice trembling. I nodded, understanding the weight of her words, the need for space to make sense of everything that had happened. "Yeah," I replied, my voice steady but my heart aching. "Maybe that's for the best." We stood there in silence, the closeness between us replaced by a hesitant distance, an unspoken understanding that this was only the beginning of something we couldn't yet define. She gave me a faint smile, a silent promise that this wouldn't be the end, and then, with knee last glance, she turned and walked out of the room. I closed the door behind her, the silence settling over me like a heavy blanket. The memory of her touch, of her kiss, lingered in the air, filling the space with a warmth that was both comforting and unsettling. I sat down on the edge of the bed, my mind racing with thoughts of her, of the connection we had shared, of the uncertain future that lay before us. I knew that things would never be the same, that we had crossed a line that couldn't be undone. But at the same time, I couldn't bring myself to regret it, to wish for anything different. Whatever the consequences, I knew that this moment, this connection, was something I couldn't ignore, something that had changed me in ways I was only beginning to understand. The hours slipped by, but I didn't sleep. I lay there, lost in thoughts of her, of the way she had looked at me, the way she had held me close, the warmth of her touch lingering on my skin. The night seemed to stretch on endlessly, filled with memories of a moment that I knew would stay with me forever. And as dawn began to break, casting a soft light across the room, I knew that this was only the beginning of a journey I couldn't turn away from. Whatever lay ahead, I was ready to face it, to see where this path would lead, even if it meant navigating uncharted waters, even if it meant facing the uncertainty that loomed on the horizon. But as I watched the first light of morning filter through the window, one thought remained clear in my mind. This story wasn't over. In fact, it was just beginning. The morning light cast soft shadows across my room, but any comfort it might have brought was overshadowed by a tangled mix of emotions. I stayed still for a long moment, staring at the ceiling, replaying the night in my mind, trying to make sense of everything that had happened. The memory of her touch, the closeness we had shared, was etched vividly in my mind. A mix of warmth and uncertainty that left me feeling both exhilarated and uneasy. I finally got up, moving through the familiar motions of my morning routine, but every movement felt surreal, like I was drifting through someone else's life. Surreal, like I was drifting through someone else's life. Downstairs, the house was quiet. I lingered in the hallway, hesitating at the top of the stairs, wondering if she was already awake, if she was feeling the same turmoil that had kept me up all night. I took a deep breath and made my way down to the kitchen, bracing myself for whatever conversation might be waiting. But when I entered, the room was empty, save for whatever conversation might be waiting. But when I entered, the room was empty, save for a note left on the counter in her neat handwriting. I picked it up, my heart pounding, and read the simple message. Had to step out for a bit, back soon. The day stretched on, each hour crawling by as I tried to keep myself occupied, my mind constantly drifting back to her, to the memory of her presence, the feeling of her hand in mine. I knew that things had shifted between us, that whatever boundary we had crossed was impossible to ignore. But I also knew that we couldn't just pick up where we left off. There were too many questions, too much uncertainty. The afternoon sun was beginning to set when I finally heard the front door open. I felt my heart skip a beat, and I made my way down the hallway, trying to keep my expression neutral, even as my mind raced with anticipation. She was standing by the door, setting her bag down, her gaze meeting mine with a mixture of hesitation and something else, something that made my pulse quicken. She gave me a faint smile, her eyes searching mine as though trying to gauge my reaction. "Hi," she said softly, her voice barely above a whisper. "Hi," I replied, my own voice tinged with the same uncertainty. We stood there in silence, both of us caught in the unspoken tension that had been building between us, the memory of last night hovering in the air. I wanted to say something, to bridge the gap that had grown between us, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, I just watched her, waiting, hoping she would make the first move. Finally, she took a shaky breath and looked away, her gaze fixed on the floor. "About last night," she began, her voice trailing off as if she couldn't bring herself to finish the sentence. I stepped closer, the distance between us shrinking until I could feel the warmth radiating from her. "We don't have to talk about it if you're not ready," I offered, my voice soft, hoping to ease some of the tension that was holding us both in place. She looked up at me, her expression conflicted, and for a moment I thought she might turn away, might retreat from the connection we had formed. But instead, she reached out, her fingers brushing lightly against mine, her touch hesitant, but unmistakably there. "I don't know what this means," she whispered, her voice filled with a vulnerability that made my heart ache. "But I know that I can't pretend it didn't happen." I nodded, understanding the weight of her words. "Neither can I admitted, my voice barely audible. The honesty hung between us, a fragile thread connecting us, and for the first time, I felt a glimmer of hope that maybe, somehow, we could find a way to navigate this together. We moved to the couch, sitting side by side, our hands still intertwined, a quiet connection that felt more real than anything I had ever experienced. The silence between us was no longer heavy with unspoken tension, but filled with a quiet understanding, a shared recognition of the emotions that had brought us to this moment. "I don't know where this is going," she said softly. Standing, a shared recognition of the emotions that had brought us to this moment. "I don't know where this is going," she said softly, her gaze fixed on our intertwined hands, her thumb tracing gentle circles on my skin. "But I don't want to lose this, whatever it is." I squeezed her hand, my own heart pounding with the same mix of excitement and uncertainty. "Me neither," I replied, feeling a strange sense of calm settle over me. It was as if all the questions, all the doubts had faded away, leaving only the simple truth of what we were feeling. We sat there for what felt like hours, neither of us speaking, just holding each other's hand, lost in the moment. The sun dipped below the horizon, casting the room in a soft, warm glow, and I felt a sense of peace that I hadn't known was possible. For the first time in days, the weight of our situation didn't feel so heavy, and I allowed myself to simply be, to enjoy the quiet connection we had found. But even as we sat there, wrapped in each other's presence, I knew that this was only a temporary reprieve. There would be questions, decisions to be made, boundaries to navigate. And though I wanted to hold on to this moment forever, I knew that reality would eventually intrude, that we couldn't stay in this ended state indefinitely. She seemed to sense the shift as well, and she looked up at me, her expression tinged with sadness and something else, a quiet determination that I hadn't seen before. I think we need to take things slowly, she said, her voice steady but filled with a quiet strength. There's so much to consider, so much to figure out, but I don't want to lose this connection. I nodded, feeling the same mixture of caution and hope. Whatever happens, we'll figure it out together, I promised, my voice filled with the conviction of someone who knew that this moment, this connection, was worth fighting for. We sat in silence once more, but this time it was a comfortable silence, filled with the quiet assurance of two people who had found something real, something worth holding on to. And as the night deepened around us, I felt a sense of contentment settle over me, a quiet certainty that, whatever lay ahead, we would face it together. She finally pulled her hand away, giving me a soft smile that held a world of unspoken promises. I should get some rest, she murmured, her gaze lingering on mine for a moment longer than necessary. Good night, I replied, my voice filled with a warmth I couldn't quite put into words. She stood up, hesitating for a brief moment, and then leaned down, pressing a gentle kiss to my forehead. It was a simple gesture, but it held a depth of feeling that took my breath away. I watched as she walked to the door, pausing to look back at me with a soft smile that told me everything I needed to know, and then she was gone, leaving me alone in the quiet, but with a newfound sense of peace, of hope. The memory of her touch, the warmth of her presence, lingered in the air, filling the room with a quiet contentment that stayed with me long after she had gone. As I sat there, lost in thought, I realized that things would never be the same. We had crossed a line, ventured into uncharted territory, and there was no going back. But as I thought about the future, about the challenges and the uncertainties that lay ahead, I felt a sense of calm that I hadn't known was possible. Whatever came next, I was ready to face it. And for the first time, I felt like I wasn't facing it alone,